Daniel tells the story of a young man who endured life under several kings. Now, the list in my study Bible has 4. I looked in another book I have that's a little, just kind of a capsule study for a quick consultation. Says that they think that a lot of scholars think that the last kings mentioned, well, the first in my study Bible is Nebuchadnezzar. Of course, Babylonian is the one that took the Jews into captivity. Belshazzar in Babylonia. And then the Babylonians were defeated by the Media-Persia, Darius. And so in this, it has the third king, Darius, who is the one that we'll be looking at today, and then Cyrus. Now, one book says we think really that Darius is the title that means king. And they think Cyrus is the one referred to in both of these, in these chapters 6 and 9, calls him Darius, and then in chapters 10 and 12, as the story continues, they refer to the king Cyrus. So whether it is or isn't doesn't make a lot of difference, but nevertheless, can you imagine being having to adapt to that many new bosses? Maybe you have in your work life had to adapt to a series. We certainly did. And you know what I found at the Avalanche Journal was that it was always the upper, well, not always, but the ones that created the most stress were when they would send in a new publisher, somebody that was over everyone, because that created the stress, because the people who were in charge, the top editor, the advertising head, and those people reported directly to that person. Now, we got the essence of the stress as it came on down the ladder, but it's stressful to adapt to a new way of doing things. I remember one editor came in, and he was going to really reform the newsroom. He didn't have a great deal of experience. He didn't stay very long. It didn't work too well. But and fortunately, nobody was that interested in religion. You know how that goes. Well, they didn't bother me much, and I just kind of did my thing. And as Burl said, Beth doesn't have a supervisor. I did, of course, but, it was different. And I had created something they hadn't had before, so they didn't have a set way of doing things, so they just let me do my thing to some extent, not always. Sometimes I had to help out with things like when the staff was short and there wasn't some newcomer to write the announcements of various kinds. Sometimes I had to help out. And that way, as time went on and staffs began to shrink, and now I don't know how they keep their sanity, and they don't have enough staff to do real investigative reporting. They just don't do it anymore. They don't have the funds to pay the staff because everything's on what? Well, Facebook or Twitter or whatever. I just refuse to take on any more of those. But anyway, it's tough to adapt to a new environment, and Daniel seems to have no problem at all doing so. And but it had to have been difficult. Well, the first 5 chapters tell you. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. his best buddies, are sent to the fiery furnace. And I guess once you survive the fiery furnace, you have a pretty high trust level in what God can do. Daniel is noted for his ability to trust God. Now, you notice we don't read about a family. These were the upper cream of the crop people that were carried off from Jerusalem originally and put into the service of the Babylonians. So they're the top talented, promising young people. And they actually grow up in that. They're teens, probably. And you know they are chosen to serve the king. And do you know what that means, to serve that close to the king? They are also eunuchs, because the practice was they didn't want any threats to the king's harem. So to serve in the household of the king, they had to be made eunuchs. Daniel had been through a lot, as had the other young men who had been brought in under the king. Yes, they had a plush life. You remember the story right at the outset when they refused to eat the king's rich food, and Daniel proposes the contest, and his group is healthier and does better than the ones eating the rich food of the king. So it's been a test all along the way. And isn't life kind of like that? It's a test along the way. And we're not quite, I don't think in today's environment we quite realize that until we get older and we look back and we see the test we passed, and sometimes we see the ones we didn't pass. Well, Daniel can look back and see that he has passed those tests, because this struck me. Nobody had ever mentioned his age. He was about 80 years old in today's story. Had you thought about that? 80 years old. I found that interesting. Now, if you remember, God sent an angel to protect Daniel's friends in the furnace, and they came out unharmed. And that miracle led King Nebuchadnezzar to declare that no one in the kingdom could speak ill of the God of Daniel. That meant you better not be plotting against Daniel because his God is different. Now, that was finally. That was the test that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego passed. They refused to bend the knee to the king. Now, we're not going to go back into all that history, but this is really an interesting history of, this is the king who kind of lost his way for a while. Now, so Daniel hasn't had that direct test until now. In the 6th chapter, Daniel is appointed by the king to a high-ranking government position. Oh my goodness, and don't we know about all that goes on when somebody wants to be in a high-ranking government position. His fellow officials grew jealous and conspired against him. I can't say that I saw much of that. I saw a very little. It wasn't because of jealousy, as far as I know, but I saw some instances of people mistreated because they wanted them to resign, and that I finally tromped in one day to Burrell's office and said, you know, if you want to fire somebody, do it. I don't want to see this kind of behavior going on. The person sat around the corner from me. And it was not something he needed to be fired for. And he took care of it. and the person still works there. I don't know for how long, but he's in his mid-80s now. But my desk was right next to his, so I knew what they were doing. I couldn't help but know. And normally I didn't interfere, but that was a case that called for interference. And I could have been fired, but it wouldn't have mattered. It wouldn't have taken my livelihood. I could have done, I weighed the balance, and I thought, it's more important to stop this in its tracks, because it was bullying is what it was, and not doing your professional job. So, plus I was an old lady, they give some of us a little bit of wiggle room if we're old ladies sometimes. And then sometimes it goes the other way. But this kind of intrigue was not new to Daniel. We have all that history in the first chapters. Now, we will read the word satraps. That's kind of like governors of a state if you were to try to kind of compare what their job was. Let's begin. This is the king, the ones that had conquered the Babylonians. So Daniel's gone from serving under the Babylonians to serving under the Persians, the Mede Persians. The Persians, Iran is Persian. I believe, isn't it Iraq that's was the side of the Babylonians. So they're right there together. Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces, and he appointed a high officer to rule over each province. So far, so good. The king also chose Daniel and 2 others as administrators to supervise the high officers and protect the king's interest. Now, because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. It seems that Daniel's reputation was so well established and his work ethic so obvious that the king, the Mede Persian king, immediately knew who he could trust. His reputation was solid. Then the other administrators and high officers began searching for some fault in the way Daniel was handling government affairs, but they couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. He was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. So they concluded, our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rules of his religion. We got a pastor in Turkey who's been imprisoned, past sentence, accused of being a terrorist because he's preaching, I guess, because he has a church, and he's imprisoned, been imprisoned, 2 or 3 years? 3 years, I think, and they're trying to get Erdogan to let him go. They've got him down for 35 years in prison, and it's not a prison there. It's not a friendly place, for sure. Now, it's still happening all over the world, and it's because of his religion. So this is the only idea they came up with. We'll attack his religious faith. So the administrators and high officers went to the king and said, long live King Darius. We are all in agreement. We administrators, officials, high officers, advisors, and governors, that the king should make a law that will be strictly enforced. Now, they had a kind of a peculiar little law here. They could declare, the king could declare an order, and it could not be undeclared. They couldn't change their mind on it. So, they asked the king to give the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions. Now, how did they approach the king? They engaged his ego, didn't they? They felt like that he could surely agree to their honoring him in this way. And now, your majesty, issue and sign this law so it cannot be changed, an official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked. So King Darius signed the law. Now, it was just a 30-day ban, a month. That's not much, is it? But in Babylon, the king's word was the law. But in the Mede-Persian law, which is the one they are coming under now, if the king makes a law, it cannot be changed by the king or anyone else. Now that's quite a difference, isn't it? You better think really hard before you make that law. Darius had a fatal flaw: pride. And this appealed to his vanity. He didn't think through the consequences. Perhaps he hadn't been there that long and thought about it. But, oh, well, what could it hurt? 30 days? Nobody could pray to anyone? You know, that didn't seem like such a harsh law. Verse 10, but when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went home and knelt down as usual in his upstairs room with his windows open toward Jerusalem. They always prayed toward Jerusalem. He prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to his God. And it was a public prayer because he opened his window to Jerusalem. It was a private thing, and yet it was public. Then the officials went together to Daniel's house and found him praying and asking for God's help. So they went straight to the king and reminded him about his law. Did you not sign a law that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions? Yes, the king replied, that decision stands. It is an official law of the Medes and Persians that cannot be revoked. Then they let the hammer down, so to speak. Well, that man's Daniel. One of the captives from Judah is ignoring you and your law. He still prays to his God 3 times a day. Hearing this, the king was deeply troubled, and he tried to think of a way to save Daniel. He gets it now. He knows what the plot is now. But it's too late. He spent the rest of the day looking for a way to get Daniel out of this predicament. In the evening, the men went together to the king and said, Your Majesty, you know that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, no law that the king signs can be changed. So at last, the king gave orders for Daniel to be arrested and thrown into the den of lions. The king said to him, May your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you. Isn't that interesting? He so reluctantly had to do it, but he prayed. He prayed that Daniel's God would rescue him. That would have been a great loss to the rule of the king to have lost Daniel, and he knew it. Verse 17, a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed the stone with his own royal seal and the seal of his nobles, so that no one could rescue Daniel. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night fasting. He refused his usual entertainment and couldn't sleep at all that night. Imagine a king praying for his own law to be overturned. You know, we've all made bad decisions, I'm sure, at times. Nothing of this magnitude, probably, but you can kind of sympathize with that king, can't you? Very early the next morning, the king got up and hurried out to the lion's den. When he got there, he called out in anguish, Daniel, servant of the living God, was your God, whom you serve so faithfully, able to rescue you from the lions? And the truth is, he really didn't think he'd get an answer. Daniel answered, long live the king. My God sent his angel to shut the lions' mouths so that they would not hurt me. For I have been found innocent in his sight, and I have not wronged you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and ordered that Daniel be lifted from the den. Not a scratch was found on him, for he had trusted in his God. Then the king gave orders to arrest the men who had maliciously accused Daniel. He had them thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. Whoa! The lions leaped on them and tore them apart before they even hit the floor of the den. Now, if you think of these lions, the lions roamed the countryside and the forest in Mesopotamia. They're great big cats. Think about how your cats, if you've ever tried to keep a cat around the house. I'm not talking about the spoiled little kitty cats we keep inside, because that's the only way we can keep them safe. But you can't keep a farm cat very long, it seems, anymore, because there are predators out there that get the smaller cats. They're bigger cats. And sometimes it's bobcats, sometimes it's foxes, and even maybe coyotes. I'm not sure. I think it's more likely the foxes. I have had a fox try to get my cat before, and they finally succeeded. Also, some kings like to hunt the cats for sport. So they went out and captured cats, and they kept them, the lions, and they kept them in these deep crevice caves where there's lots of rocks in that country, all that area, and big rocks and caves and down deep. Caverns is really the better word. And so they would pin them up in those caverns, and they would feed them and take care of them in kind of a park setting until they wanted to use them for executing people. Now, that's just about as bad an execution as I can imagine. How about you? That, if you've ever watched a cat or cats, even the little cats, really are pretty scary creatures when you think about how it would be to deal with one who was a huge lion. And I can't think of many executions that'd be any worse. That was a horrible way to have to die. It's premature to give in to the pressure of unbelievers such as these people who were sure they could take Daniel out of circulation and get rid of him because they had been there for years, much longer than this king, and they knew that nothing would keep Daniel from doing his daily prayers to God. Wouldn't that be great? To be a person so strong in their faith that everyone knows who knows you that you will always put God first. Daniel is one of the premier characters of faith and trust in God in the Old Testament. He's even referred to over in Matthew 24:15. Let's look there. The day is coming when you will see what Daniel the prophet spoke about, the sacrilegious object that causes desecration standing in the holy place. Reader, pay attention. And what he's talking about, this is taken out of the description that Jesus gives of what is going to come in the future for his followers. This is that part that has some of the what we call apocalyptic literature language in it. It's where he tells his followers they will be arrested and persecuted and killed. You will be hated all over the world because you're my followers. And many will turn away and betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and will deceive many people. So this is the words of Jesus to his followers in those last days that he was on earth. And Daniel is the person that he references. Daniel, the one who was strong enough to stand in the face of such persecution. Now, King Darius sends a message. He sends a message to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world. Now, as you know, the world then was quite small in terms of territory, as far as we know. That was the civilized world that they knew. That would have been all that Middle Eastern area, and I don't know whether it went any beyond that or not. Probably not at that time. Although later it did. And here is what he says, and it's a beautiful thing that this king did on behalf of Daniel. Peace and prosperity to you. I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble with fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he will endure forever. His kingdom will never be destroyed, and his rule will never end. He rescues and saves his people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. Isn't that powerful? It's a powerful message today. God rescues. And there are many miraculous stories of rescue. Unfortunately, there are many tragedies in the world. Yesterday, I don't know if you saw the reports on the terrible accident at Branson, but the woman who they interviewed who lost 9 members of her family, her 3 little children, her husband, her husband's parents, her sister-in-law and brother-in-law, his sister-in-law and his sister and her husband, and I guess there were their children. I forget, but I have never seen such a calm and really beautiful testimony of what was happening during that. I feel probably that she was still in great shock. But there was no hate, no anger expressed. Grief, yes, but very measured. Now, I know the day's coming, and it probably already has. The time is coming when she's going to feel that anger, because we do feel anger when some tragedy occurs. And we do look sometimes for someone to blame. And here there probably is some legitimate blame. But I just couldn't help but think. She talked about that her pastor from, I've forgotten where they were from. Was it Michigan? I can't remember. Anyway, they were on family vacation. And she said the vacation was always geared to the children, things that they could enjoy. And she was holding her 1-year-old when the boat capsized, but something hit her in the head, and she doesn't know what happened, but exactly. But she liked to swim, so she survived. She wasn't afraid of the water. And perhaps it was just the way the boat capsized. For some reason, she survived. And she did say to think about going home to a house that had been always full of family. She just couldn't imagine. And, those tragedies happen to all of us. She had a church and a pastor that cared for her, and they'd already, some of them, gotten down there. And it was, she said, she talked about what a wonderful family she had married into. They were such good people. And apparently, maybe in her life experience, she hadn't known a good family. I don't know, but I know as the days come, she's going to have her faith really tested. But I thought, I don't think I've ever heard a more faith-filled testimony immediately after some horrible tragedy as that one. And I do hope they've started a GoFundMe for the news media said. But there's going to be a lot of pointing fingers, and there's going to be a lot of investigation. But it happens now all around us. Families endure tragedy to which there seems no rhyme or reason. You've been through tragedies. We've just, does our faith hold us up? That doesn't mean we don't ask hard questions and that we don't grieve. And this woman has a lot. I just can't imagine her going back to that empty home with so many of her close family gone. But trust, that's the kind of trust, I think, that will help her survive and thrive in the years to come. She looked to be a fairly young woman. So I think it is good to pray for these folks, all of them who were in this terrible accident. And this edict by this king is really astounding. And it's based not so much on his own trust, not so much his own trust in God, but his trust in Daniel, because he's seen Daniel's work. Daniel's no kid. Daniel's 80 years old. He has a whole history of being a trustworthy, valuable advisor and helper for the king. And so he knows the most important thing in Daniel's life is his God. And that might be something we ought to think about. Do people know from the way we live our lives how well we do our task, whatever it is, at whatever level of life? Do they know that God is number one in our lives? And it concludes this story with Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Or of Darius, that is, the reign of Cyrus the Persian, is what our little footnote says. The king was angry, and rightly so, with the group that fooled him into taking this action to start with. And does it remind you of another Bible story where something similar happens? The story of Esther, where Haman manipulated the king into making a pronouncement against all Jews and gives the whole country permission to kill every Jew, and then finds out his treasured wife Esther is a Jew because she reveals that to him. The tests come in all kinds of ways, but the person who trusts in God and obeys his will is untouchable. That doesn't mean things are easy or that they always look good to us in the midst of them. But to trust God is, in essence, to have that peace of knowing who is in control. And don't we need to know in this day, with all the, I almost want to say nonsense, it's worse than nonsense though, that we are hearing about various people and all of the hatred that is being promoted within our country. It's a lesson that we need as well. The lesson, the reminder to choose what is most valuable and to trust. That's what Daniel did. He valued his relationship with God above all else, above his great appointments, above even his life. There are moments in every life when we choose to deny or disobey God. And we don't think much about that because we don't feel like we're that important in the whole great scheme of things, do we? But you know, God doesn't draw those distinctions. You're as important, your trust in him is as important to him as was Daniel's. It doesn't matter that you're not the king or the president or the whatever. All he asks is that you trust him. All. That's a lot. That's everything. Identify the forces that draw you away from God so that you can stand up and always identify yourself as his follower. And how did he do that? Well, the first clue is his priority was his prayer life. I don't know, but I would guess that most of our troubles come about because we forget this one thing, to stay in prayer. to be consistent in prayer, to make time to spend it regularly in prayer. Now, Daniel is following the ritual of the day. We don't have that much ritual in our lives, but we need the prayer time because it reminds us that that is our essential contact that gives us the strength to remain faithful when we have those choices to make, and helps us make those choices in the light of what God expects of all of us. There are many people, many troubled people in the world today who have no idea about what it means to trust anything or anyone. And we're going to have more of them. And it is important that we live in the trust that we claim we have in God. I don't mean you go hitting everybody over the head with, God told me to tell you this. I just mean you live in your place, in the life that you have, in a way that makes it clear to those around you that God comes first. God comes first. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this beautiful testimony from this king of long ago. But most of all, we thank you for the daily testimony of Daniel in a time that was very difficult. As a captive, he became one of the great in a kingdom that was in a lot of turmoil over time, and yet his trust in you was such that you carried him through, and he was a great force for good in the world, as were the kings he served, in pronouncing your name above every name. May we do that in our daily lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.